Hello everyone, we are the NRDC Cap and Trade team and are excited today to present to you our research project findings from the previous few months. Our project has investigated the potential disparities in pollution burden felt by disadvantaged communities in California, attributed to the pollution from industry sources being regulated under a market system. In other words, we want to know if the program meant to curb this pollution may be making this pollution worse. Air pollution kills 7 million people worldwide every year. Every year in California, particulate matter pollution contributes to 5,400 premature deaths due to cardiopulmonary causes, 2,800 hospitalizations for cardiovascular and respiratory diseases, and 6,700 asthma-related ER visits. These figures are especially daunting since these deaths are preventable.
In particular, there are 3 pollutants that are of major harm to the public. Particulate matter smaller than 2.5 micrometers can penetrate deep into our lungs and cause lasting tissue damage. Sulfur oxides, or SOx, is highly reactive and can interact with other pollutants to indirectly cause adverse health effects, including inflammation. Nitrogen oxides, or NOx, react in the atmosphere to create acid rain, smog, and respiratory irritation. These impacts and premature deaths disproportionately affect children, asthmatics, and the elderly.
Research has found that co-pollutant emissions rise proportionally with increases in GHG emissions. Subsequently, in reducing GHG emissions to reduce the above-mentioned co-pollutants, the California Air Resources Board, also known as CARB, has implemented such a strategy to reduce emissions, known as the Cap and Trade program. The cap in the program establishes a limit on GHG emissions, and the trade part of the program refers to the ability to trade these allowances. The program gives entities flexibility to find the most cost-efficient method to reduce emissions. This flexibility to curb emissions has led to an overall decrease in GHG emissions in the state, but a disproportionate increase in emissions in disadvantaged.
We set out to examine whether emissions increased in the past few years, expanding on Manuel Pastor's work. To do this, our group has 3 main analyses. One is a financial analysis of funding generated by the program, which is supposed to go back to disadvantaged communities, a compliance instrument analysis, and third is a geospatial analysis of the relationship between facilities, demographic characteristics, and emissions.
Let's look at the financial analysis first. California Climate Investments Program oversees all use of cap and trade revenue for climate and environmental programs. We asked the questions, how are cap and trade revenues being utilized to mitigate impacts in disadvantaged communities, and how are these tracked and prioritized?
We analyzed which entities, such as nonprofits, local governments, tribal governments, etc., are eligible for funding through these different programs, and evaluated whether the distribution of funding is equitable across sectors. Data visualizations for the percentage breakdown of each program eligibility and actual funding received by entity type is shown through pie charts. The results showed a breakdown of how many programs each entity is eligible for in percentages. This represents major equity concerns, as these groups deserve a proportionate amount of funding. Another area we examined for financials was to map census tract level demographic funding. We used geospatial references to see whether there are gaps in funding at the census tract level. We found 2 demographic groups were overrepresented in unfunded and low-funded tracts, tribal communities, and prison populations. So we overlaid our maps with tribal lands and prison boundaries. The table shows that 7.8% of tribal lands are completely unfunded and 19.62% are low funded. In regards to prison populations, 31.96% of areas which hold prisons are unfunded and 14.31% are low funded.
Finally, we conducted a secondary analysis that highlighted hotspots that we found in our geospatial analysis, which included the LA area, the Central Valley, Fresno, San Bernardino. Most of these programs and assessments only focused on greenhouse gas emissions offsets and did not look at co-pollutants and air pollution that influences human health. The figure shows how cap and trade could be improved for disadvantaged communities when it came to the grant application process, and highlighting action items that overlap within these 3 sections.
Now that we've looked at the potentially inequitable financial impacts of cap and trade, let's look at the relationship between the compliance instruments allowing facilities to pollute greenhouse gases and co-pollutants like PM2.5, SOx's, and NOx's that influence human health. For a facility emitting greenhouse gases to be compliant under cap and trade, compliance instruments are given that represent the total amount of emissions for that facility. Our team examined the relationship between total instrument usage and emissions, specifically to investigate if there is more or less facility emissions of these health impacting pollutants in disadvantaged communities over non-disadvantaged communities. We use publicly available data, but due to gaps, much of this work involved cross-referencing data sets. We source the compliance instrument usage online and distribute them proportionally from parent companies to our individual facilities. After data compilation and cleaning, we worked with postdocs to process the data in R and examine if there are parent relationships. Here's what we found. At broad scales, there looks to be little relationship between the usage of compliance instruments and the overall emissions from facilities. In fact, there is almost an inverse relationship between them looking at the graphs here. While compliance instrument usage begins in 2013 and is much higher in 2018, emissions overall from 2011 to 2018 declined for all major co-pollutants of our study.
In these graphs relating individual facilities, there is a general trend that as compliance instrument usage increases, emissions do as well. The relationships were far weaker in 2013 through 2014, except for GHGs, while there are much stronger relationships for the 2015 through 2017 for pollutants apart from PM2.5. This suggests that the program may have increased emissions with facilities using more compliance instruments, even if emissions decreased overall. This suggests that disadvantaged communities may have been disproportionately burdened. When looking into sectors in 2015 through 2017, where this relationship of usage is especially apparent, we saw that the disparity felt by disadvantaged communities significantly increased in total amounts. However, looking at sectors individually also suggests that emissions may increase at higher instrument usage rates for non-disadvantaged communities as well. Confounding estimates prevent one clear conclusion.
Now that we've looked at the evidence for inequitable financial impacts and use of compliance instruments, let's examine the third part of our study. This is a closer look at the relationship between facilities, demographic characteristics, and emissions. We used geospatial analysis and focused on census tracts that were in the 25% most disadvantaged communities. For further analysis, we also took a detailed look at spatial patterns in 4 regional hotspots in California, which are areas where pollution burden, poverty, and income statistics are poorer than the state's average. We calculated changes in facility emissions of the 3 hazardous pollutants and characterized income, race, and poverty of nearby census tracts that are within a 1-mile radius of these facilities. Here's what we found. Most of the emission circles fall in disadvantaged communities, especially in LA and the Central Valley. This map shows the amount of PM2.5 emissions from facilities under the cap and trade program in 2011 and 2018 increased in LA and the Northern Central Valley.
We looked at facilities that had increased their emissions of any of the 1-3 health impacting pollutants, and then examined which census tracts fall within a 1-mile radius of the facilities across the state. For those located within 1 mile, the percentage of people that are white is 5.5% higher, 4.8% more people live under the poverty line, and 4.7% have less than a high school diploma. The main takeaway is that environmental health burden has largely fallen on disadvantaged communities. Taking a closer look at the hotspots, we see a similar pattern to what we see at the statewide level. The geospatial analysis combined with our statistical analysis for all 4 regions shows that there is substantial pollution burden. These areas exhibit lower income, higher levels of poverty, and are communities with fewer white inhabitants compared to the averages for the state.
So all 3 sets of analysis that we've done show there is evidence for potentially inequitable outcomes associated with cap and trade legislation. We do want to recognize that what our data suggests is not a complete picture, being that much of the public data on emissions and compliance instruments is not made available or is missing. This is especially true given that our estimates of compliance instruments for facilities of larger companies are not properly weighed. With making this data more public and further research, we hope if there are similarly suggestive findings that action is taken from state legislators and CARB.
Further, during geospatial analysis, we found minimal data on census tract level of pollutants, especially for NOx and SOx. More well-rounded and detailed data could have assisted in our analysis.
For financial distribution, most California climate investment funding is being awarded to state and local governmental entities rather than other policy stakeholders like tribal governments, farmers, and nonprofits. There are also funding gaps identified in census tracts that consist of tribal lands and rural areas that hold prisons.
Given these findings, cap and trade funding would be improved by explicitly addressing short and long-term environmental health issues and having grant distribution include strengthened community engagement, aid for the application process, guidance after grant distribution, and more outreach overall.
Thank you for listening.